Got a couple minutes, huh? You sick? You stay over in that corner, Steve.
What's that?
You stay in that corner. if you're not-
You are, yeah, and I'll just have you get the slides. That's fine. Is that the way you can go like, way in the corner? Oh, here, why don't you just stay, just stay, I'll say it, but I pull it up. Dana, we have Dan's on. Man,
Always wish I had more time.
Oh, yeah, that's good. Them look great.
Stuff just gets chewed up.
Yeah, hey there.
We're here.
Down, capital E, downtown, capital G, capital F.
Don't you have?
Got screwed up the first couple times. That's
across the street. Drill. Is that what they're doing? Yeah. Thank you. Wait to be for issue. You need to give an agenda, everything.
On.
I can help choreograph it, get data through the agenda.
Dan's gonna be here.
He said he was one.
Dave, my days, you know.
Yeah. Hey, agent. Said the process is gonna be a little late.
Us is gonna be like.
Late on as well.
Why don't we do?
That's a comes.
We're pretty lucky.
Can they close you?
They are going to take over now, break it out price and both, there were 2 14 seniors in the river. Not the criteria for next year's scholarship, you might need, so they both got 14 grand. Oh, that's awesome. Wow. If you do the math, it doesn't leave a whole lot left, right? And price minus 14, things feels pretty affordable. Just a fun one. That's right. That's right. Very good. That's what I like. We have our. Great. Boss respects his revenues and that. Yeah, got a draft of the. Yeah. I thought. We're going, cheaper golf tournaments the same day, so trying to do it. Accommodate that, so she haven't had a chance, but I look at what she's recommending for. God, are we gonna wait or are we gonna get going? Let's get going. So, welcome everybody. This is the local government advisory committee meeting for Monday, May 22nd, here at the Hive, beautiful downtown Grand Forks, under item 1, introductions of protocol. Here.
Michael? Travis?
Michael's online.
Oh, okay.
Just got it.
Hagan?
Here.
Anderson,
Here.
Palmesino, Doctor, Wheeler,
Here.
Hilliard,
Here.
And also Dan Mellon.
And Malak is also on.
and Malaka. Okay,
I'm here.
okay.
Here, Dan.
Thanks for being here, Dan. Item two, information items, we've got, enclave development that we're gonna discuss for everyone's information, then we have action items. The current tax incentive projects, the historical, local government advisory, mini projects, 3-1 Epitome, 3-2 Memorial. So, Todd, did you want to take over on item 2.1?
Well, just we have some new folks and we even have Manville Public School here, so thanks for everyone being here. On the back side of this page, there are all the projects. We're on projects 9 and 10. So since getting around 2017 to 2018, and the state legislature required after the 2017 session that any tax incentive, and for the most part today, we're going to be talking about payment in lieu of taxes or pilots. And with a pilot with the state of North Dakota, you can go up to 20 years for a tax exemption. So we're going to be, both these projects are pilots. But after the 17th session, they required anything greater than 5 years, required the school district, whatever the local school district in the county to approve tax incentives. So the city of Grand Forks with our partners created the local government advisory committee so that everybody would hear the tax incentives up front. And then when we proceed from the city council to the various taxing entities, everybody had heard the story up front and we're hearing it after the fact. So that's why we've done here. And so this is 9 and 10. We've been successful in the first 8 projects. So we intend to work through these projects 9 and 10. So thanks for everybody for being here. And we also said that we would update if there were projects that were less than 5 years or less that the city approved, just for your situational awareness. And I want to give you an update that we did approve an enclave industrial development project that's in your packet. And essentially, that'll be along I-29 south of Ironhide and Revolutions, and it'll be 100,000 square foot built industrial facility, multi-tenant that Enclave is going to develop. And Enclave is a developer out of Fargo. And so that really helps. One thing Grand Forks lacks is infrastructure ready and building ready industrial buildings. So this will really help us in that regard. So we're thankful for that. I would anticipate there's 3 other areas that where we can see industrial logistics development. The other part is where the city's business park is, and that's, I'll give you some business. That's FedEx, Acme, Pro Transport, and Border States. We can see similar developments that we'll ask for. We're going to try to keep all those projects within 5 years. The other area that's opening up is Coast Materials has come to town, and they've taken over for a large part of the Wells Concrete property. And so they're paving the street there right now, and they're going to provide similar industrial developments, kind of 20 to 40,000 square foot industrial facilities. I would suspect they're going to come back and ask for a similar, but that'll be a business to business prospect as they develop the lots. And then finally, off of Highway 2, Simonson's are planning a logistics park in and around where their truck stop is. And they're looking at similar facilities in that area. So those are the areas you should do. And we're trying to add horsepower, wherewithal in our community. And really, since the city of Grand Forks really is the economic engine for this area, is that we're trying to grow the economic pie here in the area. So I just want to highlight the Enclave one. The city council approved 100% 5-year. And you can see where that's the first one up here on this graph. Right now it's paying 8,000. The land is valued at 8,000. It's when the city brings it in and as part of an industrial development, it's going to go, the land is estimated to be valued at 1.365 million. And so it's going to go pay taxes of 22,390. And right now it's paying very low. And then after this, in year 6, it's going to go up to 135,590. So you can see what we're doing just in that one project to really grow the tax base here in Grand Forks. That's all that I have on that particular one. Thanks, Andy.
Anybody have any questions about the enclave development? No. Very good, thank you. Moving on to action items, Don.
And then Epitome Energy, I want to introduce Mr. Dennis Egan is here on behalf of Epitome Energy. And we've been working with Dennis on this particular project and here we are today. And also Keith London, the Economic Development Corporation is here too. So I didn't want to, I'm not going to belabor these, but we gave this presentation to the committee of the whole. And so presentation's up there. I just want to highlight a few of the slides just so you get a situational awareness of this project. Next slide, John. And then here's the project. And maybe Dennis, would you mind just giving us a quick overview of what you're planning and why you're here in Grand Forks as part of the project?
Yeah, we're building 42 million bushel soybean crush facility. The region, through our feasibility study, demonstrated that the lack of value add really was hampering economic growth. It was hampering the value of soybeans specifically. The business model for farmers in this area have been for the last 30 years is to ship all the soybeans to the West Coast for export. Back in 19, we saw a hiccup because primarily the beans are sold to China. We saw a hiccup where China for a number of months decided not to buy soybeans from the United States, and they were getting them from Argentina and Brazil because of the economics around. So soybeans were stored. Local farmer didn't have a market for that. So bringing value add into a marketplace really is pretty significant. The University of Minnesota did a study on a project of our size, determined that the economic value for a community that hosts is about $300 million in new economic activity in and around on an annual basis for soybean crush facilities of our size. So we will have 42 million bushels of soybeans grown primarily in a 60 to 80 mile radius. Will be trucked in. We do have the ability to rail in on a down year if we need to get soybeans from elsewhere. We'll have 60 million gallons of degummed crude vegetable oil, primarily being used in the renewable diesel and the sustainable aviation up and coming industry that we're seeing around the United States and Canada. We'll have 55, 60 jobs as part of this plant. It's a 24/7 operation. And we're really excited to call Grand Forks home. Many of you know we did make a transition from Minnesota to North Dakota for a number of reasons. Partly with permitting and the duration it takes to get any projects done, but also as and you paying attention to the politics in Minnesota right now from a tax and a number of other things. It just was a smart decision to move to North Dakota, and we're really excited to be here. And Grand Forks has been a hub of agricultural kinds of value add. And so we fit, we think, with the makeup and kind of the direction that Grand Forks is in.
Thank you, Dennis. Next slide. Here's the location, and you can see where, the airport, the wastewater plant is, and lagoons and I-29. So on that site is on north of 70th Avenue North, and then you can see the inset of what that's going to look like. Right now, Epitome Energy is planning on a 75-acre site, but I think they can go up to 100 acres as Dennis has provided to us. And so that's the location. It is north of 70th Avenue North. And what we discovered along the way, good for the Manville Public School, because this is a big project and it's a big deal. It's in the Manville Public School District. So that's the importance of you folks being here, and we're thankful to be here. Next slide. These are just some of the particulars we're working through with Dennis and his team, along with our other regional partners. So to do these projects, the tax incentive, a lot of times it's the easiest thing you can ever do, because trying to surveys with infrastructure is the hardest part of all these projects. So we're working through on that. Next slide. Next slide. And these are just some various slides we're working through with the infrastructure. So you can keep going through. This is potable and fire protection water. Next slide. This is gray water use that we've talked with Dennis and his team. And the next slide is wastewater collections. Next slide. Stormwater management. Next slide. Transportation. So those are all the areas that we're working with them. Next slide, John. And then as part of that, you probably heard, if you followed the Fufang project, you may have heard the word development agreement. So this is our development agreement we're gonna work on. It's gonna look similar to Fufang's development agreement. And so these are the various parts. So today we're gonna talk about the tax incentive, as you can see, section 6. And whatever gets determined as part of this tax incentive will go into section 6 of the development agreement. And you can see all the other various conditions that we'll have similar to next slide. Next slide. And then we talked about the tax incentive, and I provided this in the staff report. There are two, the governor says there's 3. He's very proud of Governor Burgum of there's 3 soybean crushing facilities planned. There's 2 that are already under construction. The Castleton soybean crush facility, we've talked to Dennis, is probably the closest thing that we're going to see to Grand Forks' facility. It's relatively near the city of Castleton, similar to Grand Forks' case. And as a similar design, similar vendor that's going to provide that technology. So we really kind of focus on the Castleton. Spirit Wood is again in that Spirit Wood industrial complex that you see along I-94. That's where that facility is going. And you can see the important part of this, when we've talked about this pilot exemption, is the Castleton was provided a 15-year 83%. Spirit Wood is a 62% over 15 years. So they're both 15-year exemptions. Also, Cass County provided the facility in Castleton up to $3 million of transportation funding to get roads to their facility itself. And then you can see in the Spirit Wood example, they have an industrial park where they provided them some land in that area. And you can see where they also provided them various incentives to get there too. Looks like up to $2 million for, I'll call it infrastructure development on that particular site. Next slide. Fufang is another benchmark for us, and if you average that 90 and 75% over 20 years, that's 82.5% effective over 20 years. And then JR Simplot, we've had 2 exemptions with them, which is a big deal for Grand Forks. In 2010 was a monumental task, is that they decided to renovate their facility, their pre-treatment system at 26 million, and then most recently a high bay freezer at 58 million. And that was one of the first projects that we brought through this local government advisory committee. Thank goodness it approved, because now we see a wonderful addition that we want Simplot to keep investing in. Those are both 80% 10-year exemptions. So those a couple of other benchmarks as we look through it. Next slide. And then the Epitome Energy, Dennis mentioned in the Crookston site. And so they were proposed to get 100-year or 100% 9-year exemption, and Dennis provided us a max you can get in the state of Minnesota. Also, in the state of Minnesota is a little bit different than North Dakota, that they had a promise to provide offsite infrastructure for the project through the Minnesota bonding bill, if the project were to move forward. Next slide. Again, here's the Epitome site and some other areas that were the various infrastructure. And the next slide. Again, from here, just so everyone knows, we're on number 2 right now, but number 1, we're ongoing working on the infrastructure development in this area. Today, we're going to talk about number 2. We're continuing to work on the development agreement and negotiations. And then finally, all this will have to come together under a development agreement with Epitome Energy with all the various particulars. But usually 2 of the first things that we try to move forward with is the tax exemption. And then the next thing that will be coming will be the planning and zoning parts of this particular project as we work through all the various general infrastructure items in this case. With that, we had a conversation with Dennis. When I say we, the city administration had a conversation with Dennis along with Keith London of the EDC. And our recommendation in front of you today is an 83% exemption over 15 years. One of our lessons learned from the Fufang project is we wanted to make incentives less than 20 years. And so we're within that 15 years. We started out talking with Dennis at an 80% 15 year. And we arrived at something very similar, if not the same as the Castleton facility at 83% at 15 years of an equivalent facility. You can see at that, if you look at the graph here and along with the further information, it's the second graph down here in the energy. The other thing that's important to note and Dan reminds us, our city attorney of this, is land is never exemptable. So you can see in this case, right now, the land is valued at $60,000. Our estimate, once this becomes an industrial facility, is the land will be valued at $4 million. And so the important part is we want to change land in and around the city from ag to industrial development because it jumps in price. The other part is that we're only 17% of that initial facility will be taxed, the real property. And you can see, starting in year one, it'll have a taxable value at what we estimate at 530,000. And then in year 16, it'll rise up to $3.2 million for all the various taxing entities. And so in my staff report, I detailed who's going to get that, but I think Manville Public School is the largest share of that, then the city of Grand Forks and the county, and then the park district of that. So I won't run through all that, but lo and behold, that's a large taxpayer in the city of Grand Forks, and you're on the range of that of even at the 500 some thousand of what Simplot is. So it's a really big deal. So with that, Dan, is anything further on this one that we've talked about with Dennis and Pimmy Energy?
I don't think so. I mean, trust me, well, Grand Forks and County are probably familiar with the pilot process, but one thing that's unique here is that a lot of times the pilot would be a set dollar amount throughout the entire 15-year period of time. We do it a little differently here in Grand Forks, is that the pilot amount will be determined by the values each and every year. And so right now, the value of the buildings is zero because there isn't anything out there. And take a look at what the value, the city assessor will take a look at the values on an annual basis, come up with the value of the real property that's subject to property taxation, including the land, and arrive at what the values are and really apply the mill rate for that particular year based upon about 17% valuation. And that's why you're going to see a little different number as you progress the course of the 15-year exemption. There will be a pilot agreement that will be developed along with the development agreement. And that pilot agreement sets forth various standards for construction, sets forth the provisions as to when the pilot becomes effective. It only becomes effective once the facility is up and running. So during the construction period, it'll be fully taxable. So you might see part of the building will still be under construction. That part of the building, whatever the value is, will be subject to property taxation. And then once it becomes operational, then the pilot kicks in. But there will be various conditions that they have to satisfy. We've targeted some dates as to when completion will be. Of course, those can be subject to modification depending upon how construction goes, things like that. There are some statutory provisions as to the pilot is the potentiality of it being terminated by statute. And those are embedded within the agreement as well. Fairly similar type of pilot agreement that you've seen with Bang and the others that developed in the last couple of years. So if anybody has any questions procedurally, that's the next step. Is there will be after this, as Todd mentioned, after this meeting, then we go out to the school district and the county to get their, well, we have to provide them notice. If they don't respond, that means that that entity is okay with the pilot. If they do respond, then we have to have discussions, but we always go out and visit with them at their meeting during that. Where they can ask whatever questions they want to ask. After that, then there's a public hearing, editors to come in and say what they want to say or whatever statement they want to make, and city council ultimately then would approve the pilot. So there is a little bit further process to go through, but this is the starting point.
Plan to bring whatever the recommendation to the June 5th city council. We set the public hearing for July 5th. And so it'd be basically between June 5th and July 5th, we'd like to come to your meetings and brief you on it and get a recommendation from your With that, Council President Sandy, I don't have anything further, but it's a big deal. This project's a big deal.
I just want to say there's a tremendous amount of work that has to be done. Environmental work, transportation, water, wastewater. The city's got, months and years before this thing happens. We're not green lighting the project today. This is just the tax incentive portion. So I think that's important for everybody to realize that, if it comes out today or comes out in your entities, you're approving this. You're saying yes to the tax incentive. You're not saying yes to the full project yet. The city has, as you've seen, a lot of work to take on to get to the finish line. And these are tough, but we think that they're worthwhile to our farmers, worthwhile to our community. That's why we do all the work that we do to make them happen. So.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. I think it's also important to recognize that we're doing the development agreement process for a reason. Mr. Gostick now has extensive experience working on development agreements, and we will be looking at all of those requirements, whether it's water or air or all the permits, you name it, and they will be incorporated into that agreement for a reason. And so I would like to point out that although we're not approving it tonight, we're only talking about the financial incentives. That development agreement is very important for our community because it will set the standard for the minimum standards that they have to meet. And once they meet those and we can check all the boxes of the development agreement, then they will get the red light to move forward. Yeah, the green light. Red was stop.
You haven't seen Dana drive yet.
Thank you. They would give the appropriate approval. So.
I think the other thing, time is always of the essence that Dennis and his team would like to start some site work if possible this fall. And with more full construction next construction season.
Anyone have any questions about the project? Pilot? Okay.
I think out of the committee, we've asked for, concurrence.
Right.
To go to at least, so when we set the public hearing, everyone knows at least preliminarily what boards are considering as part of the tax incentive.
So we don't exactly always go around the room, but I think from my standpoint, because the incentive falls aligned with what they've been getting at Castleton and others, I personally would be supportive of this project and would be talking to other city council members and actively supporting it at the next council meeting on June 5th. I don't know if Mr. Weigel, you nods concurrence. So I think so as a group, it's important for all of you to know that we will be going back to the city council meeting and actively supporting this project. So we would hope to get the similar concurrence or if you have additional questions or if you want to discuss the concepts of pilots in general, we're willing to entertain those concepts here as well. But what we prefer to know when we walk out of here is the general consensus of what you are going to be saying at your board meeting. So, Mr. Engen, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, Commissioner Ross is not here today, but obviously he will be at. Plug in. Well, what do you know?
How do you feel, Bob? How do you feel about this? Thumbs up or thumbs down?
Right up here, Bob.
Whatever I say, he will probably just disregard it all. No, I like the idea that it's a 15-year instead of a 20-year time. 83% is in line with what the other one had done. I've looked at recently at Northrop Grumman and General Atomics. They got 5 years. So this is much more generous and things have kind of come that way in the area. So my personal view is I think at this early stage, I would have no objection to this particular plan. Did you have to look at it or want to say anything or
No,
contradict me or whatever?
No, just go along with what you say.
Okay, that's how I see it for now.
I think one other thing just to point out when there's two different types of projects. Granted, one's got each school board attached to it. But there's two different types of projects. There's some that are true economic development plays, where you're not only trying to entice someone to come, but you also want their startup to be effective. You want the company to be effective, be able to grow. And, obviously when you're starting a large plant like this, you're going to have a number of years where it's going to be some feeling out and getting the project off the ground. So that's why it's attracted to them.
The second type is more of a project where you're gonna have a financial analysis that's gonna bring a project to a market rate. You're gonna have a deeper look at it by third parties. Just important to note that there's two different types of projects that will look at incentives. This would be the pure economic development plan. That's why the conversations really surround the, the developer, and is this, are you able to do the project here under these terms and get yourself started up and operating in our community? At least initially, that's where you're comfortable at these numbers to get the thing to go. Is that fair assessment?
Very much so. Just one more comment. I'm from Northwood, which is a farming community, and I know there are a lot of farmers who are really looking favorably on this development going through.
Our friends from the Manville School District, did you have any questions or thoughts or anything you'd like to share?
The opportunity for us to collect more property tax revenue is huge. We're a small district, and just in the sheer land mass, we've got very big districts. It's a significant deal for us.
It is. It's going to be a very significant deal for the school district.
And we do have a playground project coming up, so I mean.
I'm just saying.
You come to the board meeting in June or whatever, I mean, I'll be surprised if somebody hits you up for it.
It'll be a nice playground.
Mr. Malak, do you have any comments or questions online or?
I had about 5 questions, but it was a great presentation. As I mentioned to you earlier, I was just looking for information. So I appreciate the presentation. Mine were all answered. And yeah, the biggest thing was, is this kind of on par with some of the other developments? And it sounds like it is. So I appreciate all the information. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you again for tuning in. And the consensus is that we would be taking our recommendations back to the separate individual boards and asking for their approval as well.
So we'll see general consensus come out of the committee assistant voters.
Yep, thank you.
And then John, maybe the next presentation.
3.2 would be Memorial Village 2 project.
Yeah, and I'll just, and this one, as the mayor mentioned, we have Michaela Hewitt here from Baker Tilly, and she's gonna provide an overview, but this is one where we do a bud for test, bud for the incentive, the project would move forward. There's lots of moving parts in this one too. So I just want to highlight the project here in front of you. This is Memorial Village 2, and you can see where the whites Skyway connects to Memorial Village 1 and ultimately the Pollard Center. So next slide, John. Just different views. One view, next view, and the next view, and then the next view. This is we're gonna talk about this NCAA softball complex that's attached to this particular facility. And you can see the Pollard Center in the background of this particular project. Next slide. 43,000 square feet of commercial, 167 units, investment cost of 44 million. I think we have a value on it, 32 million, if I recall, property tax values. Next slide. This is one where the school district and park district is that, obviously we're trying to, as part of this project, upgrade, the UND softball, complex. And then there's also a benefit of offering this facility to Grand Forks Public Schools and regional high schools in the Grand Forks Park District. And as part of this development moving forward, next slide. Again, this is another project they'd like to get started in July and August. So time is of the essence to try to move the project forward. This is another big step on the east side of campus for UND to renovate in and around Columbia Road and University Avenue, similar to what we've done from the Cooley to Columbia. So this is kind of the next opening area. Next slide. Again, like Dan talked earlier, you can see what the developer has the estimated land value in this area. I think we have it valued at greater than $20,000 of the land value. So right now it's not taxable land. Land would get transferred to the Alumni Association and it would be taxed. And we have that taxable value at a little over $20,000. Next slide. This is, as I said, you can see as part of a broader development from UND. And you can see where the Pollard Center is. In the pink area to the south is Pollard or Memorial Village 1. And then to the north is Memorial Village 2. You can see the softball camp complex in green. The university along the old football field and next to the Pollard Junior Athletic Center, they're gonna expand it. So they'll have Pollard 2 that will have locker rooms and weight rooms and all that stuff. We're gonna put in a purple as a storm pond, and you can see down in yellow, to the far right is where the EERC is proposing to rebuild some buildings in this area. So you see University Avenue being reconstructed, Second Avenue North being reconstructed, and there's lots of underground utilities in there. So again, I'll say this, the tax incentive is one piece of this. The other pieces of this are really the infrastructure redevelopment that we're gonna have to partner with the University of North Dakota on how we get all this done as part of this particular development. Next slide. Next slide. And so we're here, there's lots of infrastructure moving pieces that we're gonna work together with UND and the developer. We're here today to talk about the pilot. And Michaela, we're gonna talk about we called it a growth fund loan, but it'll probably be a Grand Forks Economic Development Loan consideration. That's for a city council to decide at some point in the future. So today it's focused on the pilot itself. But intertwined is how do we cover this gap? There is a $2.5 million donor for the softball complex. We've been told that they need $4.5 million to get the field that they want. So obviously that's a $2 million gap, of which we've talked with UND and the developer regarding a $2 million loan from the city of Grand Forks to cover that gap. And obviously with all, you got to take that. As part of this. So we've tried to move this project forward. We looked at what we did with Memorial Village. We looked at what we did with Beacon by Epic. And so our goal and Council President Sandy and members of the group here is to try to find a way forward and then to bring it to this group to see how we can move it forward. So with that, I'd ask Michaela, she's run the pro forma and kind of give a recommendation about what she proposed as part of her memo and summarize that.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I think in your packet was a summary memo that we prepared following review of this project. And just as background, we were retained by the city to perform an independent third-party review of the financials as presented by the developer related to the request for assistance as for the Memorial Village Part 2. You heard the description of the project, and I'll maybe just start with the financing for this project was a little bit more complicated regarding both the property tax exemption request for up to 20 years for a financially feasible project, as well as trying to provide sufficient cash flow of the project to be able to support the city's potential loan for the softball complex. And I'll get a little bit more into the details of that financing. Our role in reviewing the project is twofold. One, to understand if the project would proceed, but for the property tax exemption. And if the answer to that is yes, the but-for test has been made, then it's working with the city and the development team to make a recommendation as to the level of public assistance and as what is necessary for both a financially feasible and viable project. The project as proposed is about a $44 million investment. It would be all privately financed by the developer upfront through a combination of private financing and equity. The private financing is approximately 75% of the total development costs, or about $33 million. The remaining $11 million would be financed by equity from the development team. The sources of funding, or excuse me, the project costs include construction, site work, FF&E, professional fees, and soft costs related to that. Because this property is owned by UND, there is no acquisition price, and the annual lease payments between the developer and UND are included in the operating pro forma. So with with the request for financial assistance, they were requesting a property tax exemption for up to 20 years. In that request was really to provide additional cash flow financing that would allow them to both repay the debt financing on the project, as well as to provide reasonable returns on the equity investment. Regarding project financing, there's generally two ways that you can look at financing. One is through a property tax exemption, in which the developer finances the project costs upfront and then receives an annual exemption to assist with cash flow and support the debt, the private debt and equity sources. The other way is upfront financing, in which the city would finance the project, a portion of the project costs upfront, either through a bond issuance or an internal fund. This one is a combination of both financing mechanisms. The primary financing structure is, again, the property tax exemption, which is the original request of the developer to the city. And that, again, is to provide the cash flow savings to support the debt and equity payments. There is also the component of city financing. City had originally contemplated providing financing for approximately 1.5 million to assist with the softball complex. Upon further due diligence and conversations with UND, the actual gap in that project is closer to 2 million. Given the current market conditions of city issuance of debt, it would have been deemed infeasible for the city to pull out to market and issue bonds due to increased interest rates, debt coverage, and other associated mechanism or requirements of debt financing. And instead, the city chose to, or is proposing to provide a $2 million loan from the Economic Development Fund at a reduced interest rate of 3% with the repayment over 20 years. The total, so with reviewing that project, or excuse me, with reviewing the financials, again, you know, our goal is to review it, to understand if there is a need for assistance and what a reasonable recommendation would be. We're diving into the operating pro forma of the project. We look at the operating revenues and expenses. This is a mixed-use project comprising of 167 apartment units, all at market rate, along with about 43,000 square feet of commercial space, of which I would say a quarter to a third have tenants that are already interested, and the remaining space to be determined. Looking at the annual operating revenues for both the residential and the commercial components, as well as the operating expenses for both the residential and commercial components, provides what's referred to as the net operating income, or NOI, of the project. And that is the revenue that's available to both support the annual debt service payments, as well as the minimum equity requirements of the development team. What we look at in understanding the private financing mechanism is what's referred to as a debt coverage ratio, and the minimum debt coverage ratio to obtain the level of financing is 1.2 times. So at stabilization of the project, there needs to be net operating income that's at least 1.2, greater than the debt service payments. We also look at the developer's projected rates of return, and we look at both the cash on cash, which is a 1-year annual rate of return, as well as the longer term internal rate of return over both the 10 and the 20-year period of time. We look at those different metrics to understand if the assistance is warranted, and if so, what a reasonable level of assistance would be. And with this project, without the annual cash flow assistance through property tax exemption, the minimum debt coverage would be less than 1 times, meaning that there would be a significantly reduced amount of debt that could be supported by the project if there was not the property tax exemption, as well as not sufficient cash flow to be able to repay in the development team's equity investment. Again, supporting the need for the property tax exemption. Again, in looking at the operating pro forma, diving in a little deeper, we looked at the assumptions for the developer, both their financing, as I mentioned, 75% debt, 25% equity. Looking at what the projected lease rates are for the apartments and the commercial space, are they in line with the current market conditions of the city? What are they assuming for vacancy rates? And then as well as their annual operating expenses for both the annual inflator for both the operating revenues and expenses. The point of reviewing all of these is to understand if the assumptions that are used to prepare the projections and support the request for assistance are within market conditions and reasonable. So upon conclusion of reviewing all the financials, again, we can support that following review of the project, that there is a need for financial assistance through a property tax exemption. The exemption as recommended would be 100% exemption for 10 years, followed by 80% for the remaining 10 years, for a total of a 20-year exemption, blended 90%. And in addition to that, the developer would receive a loan from the city of up to $2 million to assist with closing the financial gap for the softball complex. And the developer would be responsible to repay that city loan back to the city. And what's been requested is additional cash flow savings in the first 3 years of interest only, followed by 17-year amortization. And really in looking at the cash flow as part of the need for financial assistance, also included within the operating expenses would be a land lease payment back to UND as part of the conversation from increasing the city's participation from 1.5 to 2 million for the loan through the Economic Development Fund, is that additional cash flow savings from the project would be required, and it would be more than what the property tax exemption is. So UND has also agreed to reduce or forgive the annual land lease payments from the developer to UND for a period of time to again provide sufficient cash flow to repay the $2 million loan over 20 years, plus meet the minimum debt coverage and equity requirements. So again, in conclusion, the request or the recommendation is to provide up to a 20-year tax exemption that results in a 90% blended, 10 years at 100% to assist with cash flow and the remaining 80% for the remaining 10 years with also repayment of a $2 million city loan to finance the softball complex cap.
Thank you, Ms. Hewitt. That was very good explanation. Thank you. Thanks. So before we open it up, are there any questions for Ms. Hewitt, Baker Tilly? Hearing none. Todd, did you?
Maybe I'd ask Dan just to talk. I know the loan is a separate issue, but it's critically important for the project forward. Maybe some thoughts on what that looks like, security, and what would that look like? Just for this group, obviously it's gonna be a city council decision.
Yeah, it'll look very similar to any other loan that you and I would generally enter into. Promissory note, there'd be mortgage or some sort of security interest in the structure, and we'd probably be asking for guarantees from developers and or other parties for the repayment of that note. I can't recommend that the city go in as an unsecured creditor for a 20-year period of time. So there'd also,
Those would be personal guarantees because they don't have ownership of the.
correct. It would be an LLC would be as I understand, an LLC would be the primary debtor. And then there'd be guarantees from those that are affiliated with that LLC, similar to any other entity type of lending transaction that I've ever been a party to or seen in the past. There'd also, given the fact that I trust there'll be a long-term land lease, we need to get into some agreement with the landlord on that with respect to our security position. And similar to what other creditors would enter into. So it's the means is to try to secure the city's loan for that 20-year period of time.
Sure, but we don't need to make a decision on that tonight because the city council will be talking about that. Probably the JDA would be talking about that at a separate time. But that is part of the overall packaging.
Just so that everybody's aware that this is not unusual. We did this similar type of lending transaction, similar to the Block 5, where there was a proposed loan. I don't think it ever came to fruition, but it was a similar type of security position. Also, if you take a look at the Beacon transaction, there is under our development agreement with them, it's a little different in that there's a TIF and there's going to be a revenue bond issued, but there's also, if there's a shortfall with respect to the valuation of that building, there is some backstop provisions in that development agreement with respect to guarantees and special assessments that could be utilized to make up that shortfall if any would happen to arise.
So, and I'm sorry to dwell on this loan, but so on the June 5th, we're going to be talking about the loan as well, correct? So we'll have more detail on that.
I think there'd be also use similar to like Beacon by Epic of, with this investment to make sure that, the rules are established about use of the field, whether it's for the school districts or park district, so you don't have a change in administrations and suddenly, not interested in others using it. Maybe it leverages the Pollard Center too more as part of this. I did also have Mike Pieper is online from UND. And also had a conversation with President Armacost, and this project's important to UND. And the partnership here is important to them. He enunciated in trying to project forward with the developer too, Council President Senator.
You did, so I assume at some point we're gonna ask President Armacost why they can't internally finance a $2 million loan. Because the University of North Dakota has considerably more money than the city of Grand Forks does, or certainly our economic development fund. So you would think that they'd be able to internally finance a couple $1 million. And then rather than having to forego the land lease, they can continue to collect the land lease as well.
I think on June 5th, that would be important because it'll be a sense of providing a preliminary recommendation and also setting the public hearing to include our plan. And I would just say Mr. Ritterman's here on behalf of the developer, and I mentioned Mr. Pieper, and then Mr. Varian's in the background.
The recommendation from Baker Tilly was based upon all your financial calculations with all of the information that you currently have, including a $2 million loan at 3%, regardless of who finances it. The recommendation then to meet the threshold where they're getting the return that they would expect is 100% for 10 years and then 80% for years 11 through 20 for an average of 90%. Any thoughts, Mr. Ross? Mr. Engen? County have any thoughts?
Curious as to why there wasn't, to make an attempt to make the term shorter than 15 years. That's because one of the things that I hear people are asking me about these things is the length of time. That's why I said earlier, 15-year term strikes me as something I'd rather see, but maybe you can explain why it won't work or can't work or whatever.
Regarding the term of 20 years, that was in part tied to the term of the loan repayment. As the developer is required to continue making that loan payment over 20 years, the tax exemption is still a component of being able to provide sufficient cash flow to be able to support repayment of the loan. And also, we can look at this, we can look at this further, but as I mentioned, in looking at our returns both annually and then over a 20-year period of time, looking at the cumulative internal rate of return over 20 years, it was still on the low range of reasonable. And so if there's, if it's reduced to less than 20 years, there's a chance that the return would be below threshold and would not be deemed feasible for the equity investors. So in part, it's due to the long-term need of cash flow savings for both repayment and assuming a 20-year internal rate of return, what the return to the equity investors would be.
So it jeopardizes the project related to the people that are putting it in the finances.
Yeah, I mean, it's financing as well.
So
It's less about, the financing is based on so we always say, 10 years is typically a reasonable internal rate of return period of time. A lot happens in 20 years. However, in this project, the first five plus years, the cash flow is really important to meet the minimum debt coverage requirements. And then over the next 10 to 20 years, it's a balance of the cash flow savings to both have sufficient cash flow to repay the loan repayment to the city, as well as provide that long range equity return to the investors. So it's less about debt coverage after year 5 and more about equity investor return over that length. Now, one thing I will say that we're still, in discussions on is the term of the forgiveness of the UND land lease. So that could be a component if there's continued cash flow savings from the land lease that could positively or negatively impact the city's need for property tax exemption. And so I would say at this point, I don't know if a term, there's been a recommendation from UND, but I don't know that it's been finalized what that is, but there could be a chance based on the forgiveness of that loan, that potentially the exemption could look at perhaps a slightly different formula we're showing today. But based on what we know today, that's our recommendation.
Mr. Engen's concept of a shorter term. Let's say we went to 15 years to make the numbers work, it's 100% for 15 years. There are other taxing entities, the school district has shown in the past that they would prefer to see some return sooner than later, even if it's not 100%, right? So I think they're trying to find a little bit of balance there to make all the taxing entities get something that.
Oh, I understand that.
Palmesino or Mr. Anderson, any?
I think they've already started work with Mike on a use agreement, for the facility. I think that's a big selling point for us, that we have a facility that, since our winters are going 7-8 months now, but we can get on that turf a little quicker. So I think that's the biggest thing, get that in place as quick as we can, somewhat of a use permit. When teams are, we know university is gonna be number one, and how do we blend in the rest of them? Because this administration out there are very good to work with, very easy to work with, but we've had in the past others that weren't as easy to work with. So I think that agreement is a good one for us.
Mr. Anderson?
I would agree, and I would be in support of the project overall. I think it brings in more taxable value. Brings us some dollars with a nice infill project. Nice for UND, nice for everything overall. So I'd be in support of and would speak to other board members in support of it.
Mr. Mayor? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I think on this project, one thing to keep in mind, if, UND just decided to do a student housing project here, it's off the tax rolls forever. You've got a project in a parking lot that was, the city's still providing fire and police services, to that location without getting any reimbursement. I think you've got something that could have, in a lot of our minds, never had paid taxes ever. To be able to get, something up front, whether, 20,000, it's something to the schools after 10 years, it's more than a project that was never, a parking lot that was never gonna pay anything, it's gonna pay $680,000 to taxing revenues starting in year 20. I've said this before, I wish they made those decisions 20 years ago, because it'd be great to be on these boards when you get that chunk of change. Getting $1 million in Manville schools in 15 years is gonna be pretty exciting. Some of us will probably, you might not be on the, around anymore, probably not. So,
Won't be there.
yeah.
So the other communities, even in our state, that took a more aggressive stance on pilots and TIFs are reaping the benefits of those today. And unfortunately, we have been a little bit behind the curve, but we're also very fortunate that we have people in our community that want to make the investment and want to bring the capital improvement projects to our town.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, we're not writing a check to these companies, these developers. They're not getting any money, any payments, from anybody. We're collecting something up front and later, and the services that we're providing there will be more than covered by, the initial 10%, let alone 100%. That all goes to reduce taxes that other people are paying. So I think that's an important education part that we always have to share. There's no money transfer going, from our entities to these projects.
100% of nothing is still nothing. Mr. Ross, Sheriff, anything?
I concur with what everybody's saying.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Wyden?
I think the only thing I would add is we've talked about the property taxes, but we also have to look at youth sports in general. This gives us the opportunity to host an EDC high school fast pitch softball tournament, a state tournament, and other youth tournaments that bring in a ton of revenue as far as sales tax and everything else. So I think that there's another opportunity that we haven't really talked about.
So is there a consensus then that we're going to go back to our taxing entities and support it? Or are you, Mr.?
Only comment. The way I explain it to people when they ask me about it is, if you're changing ag land into industrial land, you're going from this amount to this amount. If you're changing non-taxable land on UND premises, the taxable land it's the same concept, you wouldn't have it otherwise. And I was in support of Bill Village one, I'm in support of this too. Just have a bunch of facts, as many facts as we can. to Bring it up to our commission.
That's what we have is we will, we'll work on that little component part that would really be on the city. Right now, Marie was planning to use we call 2163, which is the City Economic Development Fund, which the city council controls. That was the fund she was planning to use as part of it if you were to loan. But we'll bring back more details and work with you too as our local government group here to and with UID and the developers. If we can bring it back. Great.
Mr. Gillen, Mr. Mayor, anything else to add? I just want to thank everybody for being there. Thanks for making the drive to down here today. And again, I'll reiterate here, want to thank the developers, whether it's a Epitome Energy or Enclave up here, they're not willing to make these investments in a community. They'll consider on a day like this, doing something else. So I think that's great to see the interest of the community and want to see it grow. So I want to give a thank you to them as well. Being honest, Mr. Elliott, we haven't asked you your opinion on any of this to this point, but I really appreciate Park District's partnership and you have here with this. Adds value to your organization as well. Absolutely, yeah, it's happy to hear and happy to collect information to bring back to the board. And I'm just always looking for green space with the partners. So, anything else for the good of the work? None, should we adjourn? Move to adjourn. By the way, all second, all those in favor, okay. That is good.